everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Best Games Period. I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and with me, as a co-host, is Naomi Lugo, which I said your name right this time.
Yes, you did. I am not Naomi or whatever I was last week.
It was Naomi. It was Naomi.
Naomi, yeah.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Yeah, well, welcome to the show officially as a co-host. This is a big, auspicious occasion.
Well, thank you. I'm bowing, curtsying, all that jazz behind this microphone.
I feel like I should have more pomp and circumstance, like fireworks going off, like celebration
Where's my
music.
parade? Where's my cake?
Yeah,
What
exactly.
the heck? Well, how about for this momentous occasion, we talk about a game that we're both nominating as one of the best games, period. You like that segue I did there? You like that?
Yeah. I'm really excited because little bit of history about my love of the Stanley Parable. I nominated this game years and years ago. I did a list of games I thought were like the top 10 games of the generation, and I wrote it at like the beginning of 2014, I think. And I had just played the Stanley Parable, and I put it on my list as one of the best games of the generation, and I still believe that. Like, it holds up over time. It is a wonderful game, and I'm just laying my cards on the table that I really like it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I guess to start out this podcast, we need to have a pretty heavy spoiler alert, because this game, I believe, is absolutely ruined if you get any sort of spoiler. So if you're listening and you haven't played the game and you have any sort of interest at all to explore it, please stop listening for now, bookmark us, and come back to us once you play the game so, you can participate in the debate. But just know that the content in this podcast is going to be very heavy in spoilers because, we can't really talk about the game without going into that territory.
Yeah, and that's kind of the disclaimer we have to put at the beginning of any episode that talks about a game that is largely the popular term is a walking simulator.
Yes.
And that's basically all that the Stanley Parable is on a mechanical level. On a narrative level, it's something else completely, but it's also very short, so you can go out and play it and see a large portion of it within like 1 to 2 hours.
Yeah, and at the most, it's like $15 on Steam. Yeah, $15 on Steam. So, if you are intrigued by any exploration in narrative games or exploration of the gaming in general, go play it first.
I think you'll probably get more out of this discussion if you go and do that, too. And also, I would encourage people, and I always do, go out and buy the game and play it before you listen to us talk about it. Sometimes you can get away with watching a Let's Play or something, but especially in the case of the Stanley Parable, it's really something that has to be played in order to kind of appreciate it, I guess.
Absolutely. And it's one of those games where that first impression is the biggest impression you're going to get. And we'll definitely get into that later. But yeah, please just go play the game if you have any interest. And I guess now we can talk about why, with all those people kind of forewarned, you have been fairly overwarned, about why this game is so prevalent in our minds. And I guess so to back up a little bit, to describe what the Stanley Parable is, it is a walking simulator, to put it at the very, very basic terms. It's a walking simulator where you play as Stanley, which is, debatable. And we can get into that, of course, later. Stanley is an office worker who is sitting at his computer in a very, very dull office environment, or office space. And one day, Stanley's world is kind of turned upside down when he noticed that he doesn't get any sort of command. He's a button pusher. Literally, he pushes buttons all day, and he has no command. So he is forced to make the decision to go out and explore why and what's happening and look around the building. And so when he first leaves the room, or doesn't, because there is an ending where if you don't leave the room, you get, I think it's called the coward's ending. And the the lovely narrator kind of chastises you as Stanley. But if you do choose to leave that initial room, you wander around to this empty, completely empty, dull space. And eventually you hear this narrator, and he is dictating the moves that you are supposed to make as Stanley in the game. So the first official decision you make is when you come to these two doors. And the narrator, he says, Stanley chose the door on the left. But you are able to make the decision to go through the door on the right. And that's kind of the first deviation that you can have against the narrator. And that's kind of the basis of the whole game is, do you listen to this narrator who sounds very pleasant at first, very pleasant and very British. And yeah, so there's just so much to talk about this game. And there's 18 endings, I think, with the remastered game. And we're going to attempt to tackle that in an hour and a half. So bear with us.
Yeah, and I think that at the core, you brought up that kind of that iconic choice. You walk into a room and there's a door on the right and a door on the left, and you have to choose one. And there is a narrator telling you to choose one, but you can also choose the other one. And so what do you do? And I think that, like you said, kind of perfectly encapsulates the Stanley Parable's core, like what the core of the game is. And I think to a larger degree that decision point represents all of gaming, distilled down to one singular point. And that's part of what I think makes the Stanley Parable so brilliant, is that it works as a game and as a humorous, funny type thing to enjoy for like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. But it also works as a serious statement about how games work on a fundamental level.
And it's a serious statement on how human beings work on a fundamental level, because
yes.
you get this. Yes, of course, it's talking about video game narratives and video game mechanics, but at the same time, video game mechanics are commenting on human choice and human mechanics. So it's a game that it definitely deals in existentialism and I guess anarchy, if you really want to go down to it too. I was doing research on the Stanley Parable to understand deeper into it, and there was a really interesting YouTube video that I watched. I cannot remember the name of the series, but we'll put it in the description or something. And this person was talking about this concept of intended play, and that is the key mechanic that I think the Stanley Parable was trying to dissect. So intended play is the courses of action that the video game programmers program into the game. So your paths that you can choose.
Yeah, it's what you're supposed to do in any given situation.
Yes, yeah. But they were saying that even the deviation of what, say, an NPC tells you to do is still a portion of intended play.
Right, because the game developer creates the entire world.
Exactly. So it was just really interesting to think about that in an aspect, because I mean, back in the day when I first played this, I only played the remaster. I didn't play the original. So around the time that the remaster came out is when I played it. And I thought it was a completely revolutionary game because of these choices. But looking deeper at it, it's really every game kind of expects you to have these deviations. Like a really good example is Far Cry 4. So in Far Cry 4, you have a choice really early in the game where you can listen to the antagonist and you can sit at the table and wait for him to come back. But the programmers of the game know that it's our video game instinct to kind of leave the table. The antagonist told us to do something, we're going to do the opposite, right? But they did something really interesting where if you do sit at that table, you get an ending. It's like, okay, that was interesting. But of course, you can play the entirety of the game if you deviate from that response. So it was just really interesting to see this look at the mechanics of the game. So I think what makes the Stanley Parable even more interesting is that it brings in the psychological element of it versus just a story. And the intended play, of course, is that you're going to go against the narrator, because if you do the actual ending of the game, you get a very short experience, and it's you follow the narrator's description, right? You go left, you disable the mind control machine, and then you get greeted with this ending where Stanley walks out into an open field and there's freedom. But at the end, even the narrator's like, Stanley walked into the field, but he wondered back about all the different choices he might have left behind. And that is what I think sets it apart from something like Far Cry 4, where you can make these different decisions.
Well, I agree with you. I think, though, that the part that really sets it apart from everything else is the decision to make it such a stripped down decision making box. The fact that it is a quote unquote walking simulator is part of what makes it so genius, because it allows the player to identify where the choices are being made very clearly. Like your choice in this walking simulator is, well, do I go left or do I go right? And that's a very simple choice to kind of digest and understand from a player point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Where and one thing that comes to mind when I think about kind of the opposite end of the spectrum would be like David Cage's Beyond Two Souls from Quantic Dreams. A lot of people played through that game and didn't realize that they were making choices. That the way they were playing the game had actual effects on different outcomes in different scenarios. And that's because the decisions and the results of those decisions were so kind of divorced from each other. Like, people couldn't identify where they were making choices clearly.
Mm-hmm. Versus Mass Effect, where it's like, here's the evil choice and here's the good choice. Wonder what'll happen.
Right. And like in Mass Effect, for example, you have the Paragon and Renegade, and like there's the very clear options that pop up on the screen, and you know kind of what you're getting into. But all of that is even further obscured by the fact that it has all those games have more complicated gameplay mechanics going on. Like Far Cry 4, your example you mentioned earlier, that one decision you were referencing does have a very easy, like either you sit and wait or you leave. Very, very simple kind of parameters. But then when we start talking about when we start talking about decisions outside of that specific part of Far Cry 4, then we're talking about an open world game where you can approach a camp from any given direction with any kind of equipment outfitted to you, and all there are so many variables that it becomes overwhelming. And what the Stanley Parable does is it takes all of those variables away and just leaves the player alone with choices. And I think that is kind of brilliant because it puts the player somewhat in the mindset of a developer. Because a developer, when you're making a game, you have to account for player choices. And when you get right down to it, that's kind of the basis of developing a game, is accounting for the choices a player is going to make. You know, how do you get them to jump at the right time? How do you even get them to understand what it is to jump? You know, what button you press. And I think a lot of the time people take those lessons for granted. Like, and I know I'm wandering in my thought process here quite a bit.
You're wandering down your own path of intended play.
But for example, there's a whole host of learning that goes into how to play Super Mario Brothers. You have to learn how to time the jump button. You have to learn how to play through a level, and every time you play through that level, you're going to play it a little bit differently. And so there are all these different variables. When you're playing the Stanley Parable, it's all distilled down to that basic decision point. Are you going to go left or are you going to go right? Or are you just going to wait there?
Yeah.
And those are kind of your only options. And those are digestible and easy to understand options rather than jumping at 0.75 of a second or 0.76 of a second. Do you know
where
what
it
I'm getting
becomes
at?
like real world variables. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. That was a very rambly way for me to try and get to that point, but I think I made the point.
Well, I mean, you brought up an interesting point where you're talking about how the game forces you to think like a developer. I mean, the narrator is in your mind literally saying, like, this is my game. Like, how can you diverge from my game when you're wandering down the wrong path? So that hammers that point down even more.
But then you have the additional layer of the narrator is part of the game made by the developer and accounts for all of your decisions that you're making.
Yes.
And so even if you are breaking the game as the narrator is telling you, you're not actually breaking the game. You are still playing it as intended.
No, but through your first playthroughs, you still kind of get that rush and feel like you are. I mean, of course, deep down you know that is what the developer wanted, but when you first play the Stanley Parable and you don't know anything about it, you're spoiler free, you hear this British voice and you're like, okay, like this is a nice little walking sim. Maybe it's gonna try to teach me some things, like take me down this nice little stroll. And then you start diverging more and more, and you can hear the narrator just keep on breaking down. It becomes very surreal, especially one of the endings. I can't remember the names of the endings, but there's one where you go past like the storage warehouse kind of area.
Yeah.
And you jump off onto like the ledge that the narrator didn't even know you could. And he even says that. He's like, I didn't even know that was an option, which is hilarious. And you go to this room and it's just a set of staircases. And before that, you go into a room and the narrator is desperately trying to appease you. He takes you into this room where he's showing you like the galaxy and pretty lights. He's like, don't you like this? Like, I want you to like me. I want everything to be okay. And you see these pretty lights, but there's staircase, and of course you have to walk down the staircase because you just have to, because we're all little rebels, right?
Yeah.
And then you go into a room where there's just staircases, and the only thing you can do without the illusion of choice is go and up to the top and keep on jumping off. And then the narrator, he's so appalled that you would try to kill yourself just to get away from him. And that one was one where I had my mouth agape. I was like, whoa, this is this is really bizarre. And that was one of the first endings I got, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that actually brings me to a question. Did you go left or did you go right your first playthrough, if you remember?
I believe the first time I played through the game, I went through it as intended, just because I wanted to have like a baseline of what would happen if I didn't. If that makes sense?
Yeah. See, I was just like, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to do whatever I want from the get-go. And I mean, that is, of course, another portion of intended play, right? Is where the developer wants you to experience the game as the type of person that you are and see what you are going to bring to the game. I think there was a quote, I can't remember if it's from the developer or from someone who reviewed the game, but there was something like, the player brings more to the Stanley Parable than they usually like to admit.
Yeah, I think that is 100% correct, and I think that is true of every game that we play, but it is more apparent in the Stanley Parable than other games, because it is really just pulling back all of the extraneous factors and just focusing on human decision-making as the main both mechanic and kind of the main source of tension in the story. It's not even like, in reality, it's not even the Stanley Parable. It's the player parable, because Stanley as a character doesn't really have a character. And one of the endings even touches on that fact without the player, there is no Stanley. Stanley is inert. Stanley is just a figure in this whole mess that doesn't have any will of its own. And so it's not even really about Stanley. Stanley is just a vehicle for the player to interact with this world. And that seems like a very obvious thing to say about video games, that video game avatars are just a vehicle for players. But often people don't think of it that way.
Yeah, and even the narrator in most of the endings still thinks it's Stanley. And the only way that you know that that's the narrator thinking it's Stanley is that, there are a couple endings where he knows that it's not, or that he figures out that it's not Stanley. I think it's the ending where, like, you end up, I can't remember now. Maybe it's the one where you end up, like, above looking down at Stanley. Like, that's the end, but I can't remember the means to get there.
I think you get there by getting to that room with the two doors and just not making a choice and just standing there.
Yeah, and he says something like, "Wait a minute, you're not Stanley. Stanley wouldn't do this," and it's really creepy because like it's I guess it's forcibly meta where you feel like the narrator's peering back at you. He's like, "I found you." It's like, whoa, God, I didn't mean to piss you off all those times. I did, but don't be mad at me.
Part of what's interesting about it is, if you are really probing kind of the boundaries of the Stanley Parable to see what the developers accounted for, you can wind up in situations where you're like, oh, I think I broke the game. I got the better of the game. And then you find out, nope, this was actually another intended thing you can do. And a good example of that is in the opening... In the area right outside of Stanley's office, you are able to kind of glitch onto a chair, and then from that chair, you're able to walk over to a window, and you can actually walk out the window and fall out of the world. And you're just kind of in this white void, and you can see the two windows that you came out of. And then all of a sudden the narrator starts talking to you and congratulating you on how clever you must think you are for having fallen outside of the world, and isn't this fun for you? Like, it kind of talking about how players try and break the game, and that's just kind of a natural inclination that a lot of players have, seeing where the boundaries are, what they can get away with. And I find all of that really, really fascinating, both for what it says about players, but also what it has to say about game design itself. And to you've mentioned a couple times how the narrator gets increasingly frustrated with you. And I think that is somewhat a reflection on game designers themselves and how, when you're designing a game that has branching story, has branching scenarios, often developers will have to focus on what they think the main possibility of gameplay is going to be. Like, if you're designing an open world game, you're going to spend more time developing the areas you think players are most likely to go to. That's just kind of how games have to be designed, because you don't have an infinite amount of money and time. And that frustration is almost like a meta commentary on game design, because when you're building a larger game than the Stanley Parable, you can't account for how players are going to want to interact with the world, because players will want to interact with the world in an almost infinite variety of ways.
Like, when you're walking through, you just want to touch the computers to see if they do anything. Touch all the doors, which I think they intentionally did that. They put a bunch of doors on your way down this path, a bunch of computers, and they don't do anything. They make a little clicking noise, which was, I think, an intentional nod. Like, we know what you're doing. We know you're going to go here, but,
Well, yeah. And I think that there's... I don't want to say a lot of... Well, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the Stanley Parable and what it means overall. Because I looked through a lot of receptions and responses and analyses of the Stanley Parable, and there was a large number of them came down to like how the Stanley Parable was a satire of game design, and how it's a satire of the status of the game industry and how games are made, and it's just, I don't think it is. I think it is a very earnest, albeit humorous, game that gives a very frank look at how games are made.
That's interesting. See, I see it more in the frame of maybe a comedy or tragedy, like one and the other. Obviously we have the comedic elements there, but the tragedy is that disconnect between the developer and the person playing, maybe. Or the disconnect between the person and the universe that they inhabit, maybe. I think it's definitely open to interpretation.
Well, yeah, like I see where you're coming from on that disconnect level, because there is certainly that interpretation of, Stanley as a character, even though, we just finished saying about how Stanley is a empty vessel. But if you interpret Stanley as a character, he's a very, very sad figure. Like, he's under
his
control
life,
of
he
either...
exists to push buttons, and yeah, there's a literal mind control machine that has made him function his entire life, or his entire life in that building, at least.
Right, and like, he's either under the control of a soulless corporation, or he's under the control of a narrator, or he's under the control of a player, to the point where he doesn't even make decisions when he is finally freed of all of that.
And there's even an ending that suggests that Stanley might just be insane this whole time, and his body is found by another character that the game inhabits. So, which was very trippy, because it's like, whoa, okay, this is canon in the game now. So,
yeah,
what's happened? Yeah, I mean, it's called the insanity ending, and he could just be insane this whole time. Going back to that narrator, do you think he is the antagonist or the protagonist in the game?
I don't really view him as either. I view him as simultaneously I view him as the audience for what the player is doing.
Okay.
Because imagining that game without the narrator makes it a completely different game. Like, he is there to react to the player's choice, and really by himself, he has no agency or ability to affect the world, as far as I can tell, anyway.
Well, I mean, he can change the game. Like, when he tries to blow you up, he can make the countdown go up and down as he pleases, or he can reset the game, which is a huge part of it. He can reset it whenever Stanley or you are doing what he disagrees with. So, I mean, and I only bring up that question as a discussion point. Obviously, the narrator is beyond a simple definition of antagonist or protagonist, but I bring it up just to look at the narrative that they created with him, I guess. Because at the beginning, he starts out, British and charming, and he's definitely snarky very quickly. Like, if you go through the right door, he'll try to correct you, but then if you keep on going, he'll start insulting Stanley. It's like, when he goes into the warehouse area, he'll be like, Stanley was very bad at listening to directions. It's a wonder that he's kept this job for this long. And at one point he's like, Stanley is very stupid and boring, and he got this job because of drug money. It's like, okay. So, I mean, there's definitely some villainistic qualities. Again, he tries to blow you up, and he does blow you up.
Well, so my question is, does the narrator have that power in the world, or is the world that Stanley is loading into being influenced by his choice? Like it very much depends on whether the narrator is kind of a godlike figure in the universe that can just kind of control things like that, or if he is more of a reactionary figure, like, because of course you don't have to go through the game in any particular order. You could get any of these endings the first time you play the game, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's not like he has a progression from being very pleasant to being insane or leaving you or like any of that. It's much more like you can take him from 0 to 11 really quickly, or you can just follow his directions and have a very pleasant interaction with him right off the bat. But I guess I view him as just more of an audience that has some antagonistic qualities without making him an antagonist.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, generally he tends to lean more on the villain side. I think he's very passive aggressive, which can be its own villain way. Being from Minnesota, we know this. I don't know. I definitely like the narrator. I like how he contributes to the game. Like, the game would be not nothing, but the game would definitely not be as strong as it is without that very particular voice performance.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know. I struggle with viewing back on the narrator. But I mean, I think that's a part of what they were trying to say with the game, is whether or not he acts as the developer or he acts as a god in the world. It's a force that is very forceful in deciding how they're going to react to your actions. Like, it's not a pleasant interaction with him generally. And I think that's a commentary they were trying, or when you deviate at least. And I think that's something that they were trying to say through that narrator.
That
you get
there
what I'm
is
saying,
an antagonistic relationship between developers and players?
Well, not necessarily. More on a bigger scale. More like, as human beings, we are interacting with a chaotic universe kind of style.
Okay.
One that might not necessarily be in our favor. But I mean, that's really tough because obviously the universe isn't going to react as quickly. Like, if I go and do something, like, I don't know what the universe wants me to do, obviously, because it's not talking to me, I guess. So that's what I was kind of struggling with, was what allegory the narrator was positioned at on a level beyond the game developer.
Right. And I think that's tough, because I think a lot of this game is designed as a commentary on games, and so I'm not sure. I see your point about it being an like a commentary that has very existential over and undertones. But
maybe they're consequential. Like, maybe the developer isn't necessarily trying to talk about the universe in general. But see, I think the setting they chose kind of lends itself to that idea. Like, it's a very drab location. It's someone living a meaningless life stuck in an office, and that's something that a lot of people can relate to.
Well, but wait, because the very opening of the game talks about how Stanley is very fulfilled by his job.
That's true. That's true.
Like,
I guess, yeah, that's me in putting myself
buttons
in the game, obviously, versus what Stanley wants, which is, of course, kind of a mind bender.
Well, I think that because I view this as largely a commentary on games and game design, I think that what Stanley wants and enjoys and finds a lot of joy doing, pressing buttons, you can read that as playing games. Like, that's...
Yeah, absolutely. That gamers are fulfilled by just merely pushing buttons, but it's something more to them because they get whatever they need from it.
Right. They get to enact they get to have that sense of agency, the whole thing that I believe the Stanley Parable is trying to explore. And maybe that entire interaction is kind of how Stanley gets his fulfillment, and why he, doesn't mind being drone number 427 of 600 and some employees.
Which is a significant number in itself, right? We got the 42, which is the meaning of the universe, and then we have 7, which is the heavenly number, right? But...
I read it more as being 24/7.
Okay.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It's both. Huh. See, this is really interesting. I'm liking this, that we're both having such a different response to what this game means. Like, you're very much that it's a metaphor for the game developer and the gaming industry, or creating games in general. Meanwhile, I'm taking it as like this existential crisis within a game that we're able to explore. It just shows that the game, you get out of the game what the game is trying to expose out of you, I guess. So, yeah.
Well, I can definitely see it from your perspective too, because like our world, the Stanley Parable seems to have a lot of order and rigidity to it. But depending on the choices you make, it can turn into just a chaotic mess just as quickly as it can wind up being a boring, idyllic one.
Yeah, with a typical good ending, right?
Yeah. So like I totally see your perspective too. I don't want to come across like you're crazy, you're misreading this game.
I'm just having a crisis over here. Huh.
But okay. I do think that they're like from the takes I was reading, there are some that just I don't think are supported by the text of the game itself. Like again, reading it as kind of this condemnation of how, like, for example, a lot of this game came out in 2013, and like what was big in 2013 were kind of Telltale games and a lot of these very rigid narrative games, and I don't think that this game is condemning those games for existing or being designed that way at all. I just think it's talking more about how games are made in general, and how if you generally have a storyline, deviating from that can wind up being insanely complicated on the developer end.
Yeah.
Like there's a reason Telltale games kind of have that wave line where they diverge each episode and then kind of come back together at a singular point at the end of the episode, and that's because designing it any other way gets incredibly complicated when you're trying to talk about like even when you're talking about Telltale games where they usually have anywhere from 2 to 4 decisions within the space of an hour. In the Stanley Parable, you can be diffusing nuclear warheads or frolicking through an idyllic field, and accounting for all of those variables on the developer's end would quickly get mind-boggling.
Which I take as kind of a metaphor for life, right? What? Of course I do. Where there's only so many things that we can control, but there's outside factors that we can't necessarily create, but only react to.
Right. I think that's one of the big challenges of making art in general, is that we have a limited frame. Like, whether you're painting something or you are sculpting something, you only have a limited amount of material to work with. And time, or money, or resources in general. Like, no matter what you make, sure, you might be able to sculpt the most perfect looking human being ever, but they still exist as a sculpture within the confines of being a sculpture. Like,
and it's the fragment of time of encapsulated from your brain, I guess.
Right.
It's just a fragment.
And it might look like one of the most beautiful, attractive people ever conceived by a human being, but it's still always going to be a statue. Like, it's not going to come to life and start walking around and like talking with you and like conversing with you. It has limits. And I think the Stanley Parable is all about testing the limits of what games can do, and within a very strict set of limitations that it sets for itself. And I think that was a very, at least for me, a very important thing to learn about games in 2013. Because I think in terms of video games, 2013 was kind of the edge of like the open world explosion. Like, Skyrim had come out a couple years earlier, and people were thinking about games as if they were these limitless fields of opportunity. Like, oh my gosh, you can do anything in Skyrim. You can do anything in Far Cry 4. But the reality is, when you get down to it, they have limits, and they're always going to have limits. And that's, I think, something that is good to accept about art in general. And that sometimes art is better for having limitations.
Yeah, it's like editing anything, right? We could have movies that last forever and extended cuts, but it's edited back to get, or at least to try to get, the best out of every second. Like, that's what we strive to do as writers, and definitely as artists, is to utilize every inch of space that we have, utilize every word as we can best convey it, right?
Yeah. And all of this seems like, if you bring it back to kind of that iconic moment of, you're in a room with two doors, which do you pick when someone's telling you to pick one, but you can pick either? And I think that moment in itself is just really profound in a very simple way. Like, last week on Threes, we were talking about how I appreciate games that have that minimalist design to them, that kind of distill everything down to its simplest components. And I really can't think of anything that really gets at the heart of what makes interactive art so interesting as that. Like, you have two doors, there's someone telling you to pick one, but you can pick either. And what do you do? And what you do, I think, says something about you as a person, and also says something about the difficulty of designing such a space in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. Whew. So we've talked about the nature of meaning, like in the meaning of life, right? And we've talked about infinite paths and infinite possibilities and our existence in a limited amount of time. I mean, what other existential pieces can we talk about to completely blow our minds?
Well, you could also touch on the aspect that there's no escaping from it.
Yes.
Like
there's the illusion of choice, right?
Right.
But if you... I'm trying to think of one of the endings that best exemplifies this. Like, going back to the staircase ending where you can jump off the top. You could just stand there, but nothing will happen. Or there's another one where... This is one where the narrator is really hostile towards you. He takes you to your, quote, apartment to see your, quote, wife, right? But really, he's just trying to be really horrifically mean to you. You go to your apartment at your house, and you keep on clicking on parts of your, quote, apartment. And it slowly starts turning into Stanley's office, where you started at the beginning of the game. And you press buttons to keep on returning different aspects of the room. So you press K and your desk will come back. And it's just slowly morphing back. And then at the end of it, it's something like you have to press another button and you are realizing that you're going back to your office. It's pretty clear. And you think that maybe there's a way to escape and live this life where Stanley is in his apartment and he's free of this office space. But you can't do anything, at least to move forward in the game, except press that button to make Stanley return to work in the morning. Or there's another one where you're Stanley and you're slowly moving towards your doom, your inevitable painful death. There's two things that are going to squish you. And the narrator changes to a female voice, and she's desperately trying to get you to quit out of the game. And that's the only way to escape this universe, is to quit out of the game. Like, as Stanley, you can't do anything. Yeah. There's no choice there. But it goes to the meta universe that you as the player exist in and says that, yes, you can not die in this situation if you decide to no longer be Stanley and leave the game. And Stanley will be paused there awaiting his inevitable doom forever.
Yeah, I mean, like, it really is kind of the whole existential game question. Like, the only way to win it is to not play it, is to walk away.
Like in BioShock, there's the famous part, spoilers for BioShock if you haven't played it, but go play it now. The point where you meet up with, oh my gosh, what's his name? Basically, oh my gosh, what is his name? I'm blanking. It's not Comstock, that's BioShock Infinite. Anyway, Andrew Ryan. So you meet up with Andrew Ryan, and he's revealing to you that you are a puppet. Jack is a puppet.
Hey, you take that back.
And he says the famous line, a slave, or a man chooses, a slave obeys. And he's telling you to kill him. And you, as the player, they kind of give you the illusion of choice that you don't have to kill Andrew Ryan. You can just stand there. And you can just stand there, but nothing will happen. The only way to progress in the game is to press that button to kill him, right?
Yeah.
And to move on. But you don't really have a choice. You can't just walk out of the room. There's no other choice to do that. Again, because if we did inevitable choices in games, they'd become monsters quickly, and we're not quite at the point where we can create fully functioning universes with infinite choices yet.
Right.
Yet.
Like you can't go into Minecraft and make a nuclear reactor. Like, yes. the support for that is just not in the game yet.
Yeah.
Although
that's going to be update 3.5.
Yeah. Actually, on second thought, I don't know that it's impossible to actually go into Minecraft and make it, like,
I mean, you can mod it so that you can
probably
destroy it, but that's a whole other question. Because then as a mod, as someone who's modding the game, you then are like a god existing in this universe as the player, right? Not as the Minecraft character, necessarily.
Right. I think, though, that going off maybe in a different direction, that the Stanley Parable shows how in-depth and interesting a walking simulator can be. Because I know up until that point, in 2013, there had been a number of walking simulators. Dear Esther, I believe Gone Home had come out by that point. And I think that a lot of people had issues with these games and gave them kind of the, at the time, derogatory label of walking simulator because they didn't feel like they had a whole lot of impact on the world. They felt like they were kind of just going through the motions and going through a very linear narrative. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but I do think that a lot of people enjoy exercising that element of interactivity, and the Stanley Parable shows how you can do that within a walking simulator environment, but have more of that decision making going on in interesting ways.
And see, this is where a critique of the game can come in, right? Going back to the game for this podcast, I saw my Steam log, and it was surprisingly low to me. At least at first. I'd only played for 3 hours. And looking back on my first playthrough, I was like, that did not seem like 3 hours. It seemed like way longer, like maybe like 10 hours. But it brought up something as more of a critique of gameplay in general, and that is its replay value, right? There's a lot of games, these open world games that have a ton of replay value because of all these choices, right? And the Stanley Parable does not have that for me. Like, I felt like in those 3 hours, I was able to get what I needed out of the game. And I didn't really enjoy playing it again. And I kind of thought I would more. The surprise was gone, obviously, because I kind of knew what to expect. There were other endings that I had not gotten, but I didn't really have the drive to go back and find them. That might be the kind of gamer I am. I wasn't necessarily about... I'm not a completionist, at least not an obsessive one, where I need to see every ending for myself. And I don't think this doesn't make the game one of the best games, period, but I think it is definitely something to look at, is the game doesn't really have any sort of replay value. I mean, granted, it's not an expensive game. Like, you don't really have to factor in the whole price per hour, right? It's not a $60 game where you need to be like, okay, I got this many hours out of this game. This is why it was worth it. I don't know. What do you think about the replay value on the Stanley Parable?
Well, I guess I'm approaching it almost from the opposite perspective, where the fact that it doesn't have a ton of replay value doesn't really factor in for me. Like, I feel like, I guess my sense of how much time I had spent playing it was also much higher than it actually was when I looked at the game time on it. But that makes me wonder if we have just had this really long... We've been talking for almost an hour at this point about the Stanley Parable. If we have had that much to say about this game in such a short amount of time, and that it has had an impact on us, that, you know, we're talking about it like this, 4 years after it came out, 5 years after it came out almost, and we're still talking about it like this. I think maybe that it has the opposite of... I'm pointing the finger the opposite you are, where that points out to me how a lot of games could have a lot more meaningful interaction than they currently do. Mm-hmm. And that maybe a lot of other games employ a lot more fluff to kind of push up that amount of time you're spending in their world.
I think that's a good way to put it. Like, maybe we're just spoiled for expecting games to be more than 50 hours plus. And then we have tragedies like Mass Effect Andromeda, or what's that one game? The space exploration game that tried to say that... No Man's Sky, where they're trying to make so much content that it doesn't become meaningful anymore, where we lose that edited succinctness that the Stanley Parable does have.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even really like the edited... Well, maybe the edited distinctness is a good way of putting it, because, for example, I find it... Here's a good comparison. If you played the original Final Fantasy IX on the PlayStation 1, there are a lot of combat encounters. There's a lot of random battles. It takes you a very long time to get through it. But they slightly adjusted that in the remastered version that they put out on Steam. And I know people have issues with that. I happen to like it a lot. It uses the original background art, replaces a few sprites. We talked about it in the Final Fantasy IX episode that you should go listen to. But you ultimately spend less time playing Final Fantasy IX because a lot of the random battles have been more finely tuned to the point where you don't really have to grind through a lot to get through the main story. And I think a lot of games have a problem where they do include a lot of grinding. That's not necessarily important to the game and artificially inflates how much time you're spending with it. And maybe that's not necessarily a good thing.
I think it depends on the game, right? Because, I mean, there was pushback because people loved the original experience. They love dedicating a lot of time, especially to Final Fantasy games. They like having those reasons. Like in Final Fantasy VII, there is a ridiculous amount of time spent on chocobo racing, right? But people like that because they like the grind. I think we just need to not expect that kind of... that we need to have a wider expectation or wider sets of expectation for different kind of games. And that's why there was such a backlash on those initial walking sims, and why walking sim became like a dirty descriptor for these games is because those games seem to have a lesser value because they were walking sims. They're just different types of game, just like there's different types of art. Right. Like you're not gonna get the same experience out of theater as you are a flat oil piece, right? But that doesn't mean one is more valid than the other.
Right. I guess I'm talking about the games that are adding unnecessary fluff to artificially inflate their gameplay times.
Like No Man's Sky.
Well, I mean, like, I'm thinking more like, I guess, like, what would be a good example? Like how I'm having a brain fart, but basically, like, the kinds of games, like, maybe Far Cry 3, where you had to, like, climb up an infinite number of radio towers.
Or Assassin's Creed. Or
Assassin's Creed. Or, like, all these games where, like, it doesn't really matter, and you could probably get away with doing it half as many times.
And you don't need it to quote, beat the game.
Right. And so maybe that's something that can be a useful takeaway for other game developers who are playing through the Stanley Parable. You know, having less, but having that lesser amount of stuff be more meaningful, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's like we've been saying about the whole editing piece is you can have a really long, like, I guess a big perpetrator of this is like student poetry writing, right? Like and I definitely did this, is write these huge long pieces because we want to just get everything on the page, everything that we've ever experienced, right? But there is a beauty to editing it down and knowing what to edit down to make it what it needs to be. And that's like what you were trying to debate with Threes, I think, is that even the developers knew eventually after the game was released that they could have done a lot more with it. They could have made it a more matching game. They could have had more, like, different styles to the tiles. Rhymed. Or they could have just let the game be what it needed to be, and it was this simple, strategic game.
Yeah. So we're kind of getting towards the end, I think. Real quick, what do you think your favorite ending, or maybe not even necessarily ending, but segment of the Stanley Parable was?
Oh, that's funny. I was just going to ask you that. And I'm going to go with the segment that had the most impact to me when I played it, and this is a personal one. It's definitely not the most shocking one, but it's the part where we saw the developer museum. That part just drilled into me what this game was trying to be, and it was like, okay, there's like the phone from the intro piece, and the developer did a really good job of making this little museum, and that stuck with me the most, I think. At least in my initial playthroughs. Yeah, that one, I don't know, that just cemented, like, the point you've been trying to make is that this is a commentary on game developers and the games they make.
Yeah, it's funny, that was actually the part I was going to reference as well.
No way.
just being able to walk around and see all of this stuff. And to a large degree, it felt like I was getting to see behind the scenes and kind of like an artistic reimagining of the creative process. And that to me, like, it all of the Stanley Parable, when you get to that part, you look back on it and I feel like it reads as a deconstructive game. Like, you're starting and you have this fully realized final product, the main run through where you listen to the narrator and you win the day. And from there, you kind of experiment out and you're figuring out all these other decisions, and the game continues to branch and branch and branch, and you discover all these different endings. And eventually you wind up in the museum, and you can kind of see, like, some documents, where they designed it to branch out, and you see where they included all these different spots. And I don't know, I find that really interesting and fascinating, and I like when things become kind of self-aware, and especially in games, I don't see that happen all that often with a point. More often, I see that happen with a game as like a one-off joke, talking about like, haha, isn't it funny, they're in a game.
Well, I mean, that's what the developers are trying to do, right? Is they're trying to create this immersive world where you don't see the stuff, as you put it, like this stuff is reduced to that. It's just stuff, like it's just set pieces. But when it's a part of the actual game, it becomes something. So it was just really kind of stunning, because developers always work so hard to keep those curtains always closed, I guess. And yeah, it was just really interesting way to just peek behind the curtains, and it was weird that the developer kind of invited you in there.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that sets the Stanley Parable apart for me, is that it purposely points fingers at the seams of the game design and the game world, and that's completely reverse of what most games do. Most games want you to ignore the man behind the curtain, ignore the fact that this is all fabricated, ignore the fact that the world is a digital construct, and kind of they want you to buy into it as a reality, and they want you to see it as real. They want you to project yourself into it. They want you to inhabit that world. And it's very rare that you have a game that does the opposite. And I feel like the Stanley Parable does that in a really interesting way, in a way that no other game has ever done before, really.
Yeah, because it's really obvious, right? It's a literal museum of the Stanley Parable while you're playing the game.
Right.
It's not like a director commentary or special features like on a DVD, right? It is in the game.
Real talk, though, I would love if the Stanley Parable got a free update. If you're listening, William Poe? Is that how you pronounce his name?
I don't know.
Pug? William P. and Davey Wreden? I'm really sorry for butchering your names, but if you're listening...
That's a great way to start that plea.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say your names, but do this for me. Do this solid for me.
Do this solid for me and Naomi. I mispronounced everyone's name, so we're all on the same
There we go. For Stunley.
For the Stanley Parabola.
Parable.
Release a free download that includes developer commentary, because I am a sucker for that, and I wish every game came with developer commentary, and it would be fascinating to listen to yours on the Stanley Parable.
Yes, I second.
And so I guess the only other thing I have to say is, if you've played the Stanley Parable and you kind of really liked that and you're kind of itching for more of that, there is a really great free game called Dr. Langiskov, The Tiger and the Terribly Cursed Emerald, a Whirlwind Heist. And it's a free game that released in 2015, and it's very much in the same vein as the Stanley Parable, but it's doing some different things. And there's also a game called The Beginner's Guide, which is not free, but it's very good and isn't doing, even though it's also kind of a walking simulator, it's not doing the same thing as the Stanley Parable at all. And maybe we'll talk about that game on a show sometime. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But as far as the Stanley Parable goes, I just wanted to give a shout out to those other two games, and I definitely think it's one of the best games, period. Just for how it comments on game design and living in a chaotic universe where you only have the illusion of control.
And it made Naomi have a existential crisis, apparently.
I definitely think it is one of the best games, period, and should be considered as such.
I agree. We are both in consensus. That makes it real, right? We'll send you guys your plaque soon. Don't worry.
If you want to give us money to send developers plaques, be sure to donate to our Patreon at patreon.com/bestgamesperiod. It helps keep the show running because it's not free to host, unfortunately. Are we wrapping up? I started going into my end of show mode, but I realized I didn't know if we were done or not.
I think we're done.
Okay. If you want to follow us, you can follow us on Twitter at bestgamesperiod, and we are also on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Music, a bunch of places. iHeartRadio, I believe we're on. So a bunch of places where you can download podcasts. You'll find us there. And if you like us, please leave us a like, an upvote, a review, whatever your platform of choice is. That always helps our show.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Yeah, like, comment, and subscribe. And you can also find us on Game Informer and Extra Life, community.extra-life.org. And if you go there, you can find this podcast along with a bunch of other great articles about games, which I guarantee you will be an enjoyable read, an informative read. And if you don't know what Extra Life is, you can head over to extra-life.org and sign up there. It's basically this wonderful charity that helps sick and injured kids all across the United States and Canada. And all you got to do is play some games and get some friends and family or strangers to pledge for you. It's a
fantastic community, and we're doing fantastic things for fantastic kiddos. So, I mean, what more could you ask for?
Exactly. So head over there. You can read up more about it. It's a really great charity. I encourage everyone to participate. And maybe we can raise more than $10 million, which we did last year. And, this year we're gunning for, I think, like 15 million, 100 million, 1,000 million.
1,000 million. That's our new goal.
And so please be a part of that. Tell your friends or family if you can't participate yourself, or, do what you can, because every little bit helps the kids. With that being said, let us know on Twitter if you believe that the Stanley Parable is one of the best games, period, or yell at us on Twitter if you disagree. Either way, we love and encourage discussion, so throw that our way. Do you have anything you want to say, Naomi?
I am good. Go play the Stanley Parable even after our abundant warnings, spoiler warnings, and you still are curious about this game. We highly recommend it, especially if you're in the games community as a developer. This is one of, I guess, the essential reads for gamings, if you will.
Yeah, this would be like if I were to teach a course about video game design, this would be on it. So with that being said, we'll be seeing you next time for another wonderful episode of the Best Games, period. We'll be seeing you on the Flippity Dippity.